great uncertainty in times of conflict from Europe.
There was no state carriage, no line of waiting photographers, no formal bulletin pinned to a palace gate. Instead, behind one of the oldest doors in royal life, in a room where decisions are often made long before the country is ever allowed to hear their names, King Charles is said to have opened a palace record so sensitive, so historic, and so emotionally dangerous that those present understood immediately this was not an ordinary administrative act. It was not routine archival review. It was not ceremonial housekeeping. It was the reopening of a buried royal truth, one tied directly to Prince William's future, and its consequences reached far beyond one family conversation. Because when a reigning king opens a palace record connected to the future of the heir, the monarchy is no longer simply managing appearances. It is preparing for a moment it can no longer afford to postpone. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Because what unfolded around this palace record was not a minor royal adjustment. It was the kind of development that turns private tension into national consequence and family pain into institutional reality. Britain had expected another carefully controlled day, another sequence of public duties and private speculation, another period in which the monarchy gave little away and the nation was left to read emotion from posture and silence. But this time felt different from the very beginning. The atmosphere was heavier. Palace aides moved with unusual urgency. Senior figures who usually manage sensitive matters with almost invisible grace were suddenly checking dates, files, and briefing notes with unmistakable tension. Something had shifted. And by the time word began to move beyond the walls, one thing had become clear. The king had opened a record tied to the future role, burden, and timing of Prince William's place in the monarchy. And once that happened, the old comfort of delay was gone. That mattered, because a palace record is not just a piece of paper. In royal life, a record can be many things. It can be a memorandum between sovereign and advisors. It can be a sealed note left for continuity planning. It can be an internal summary of constitutional options. It can be a family instruction preserved, because one day it may become unavoidable. Royal institutions rarely move on impulse. They preserve, they annotate, they record, and when one of those records is reopened by the sovereign himself, especially one concerning the heir, it usually means the matter has crossed from emotional discomfort into strategic necessity. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. Because from the outside, the story looked like another dramatic royal development about succession, timing, and the future of the crown. But inside the House of Windsor, this was something more intimate and more devastating. It was a father confronting the reality that his reign, however present, now existed under the shadow of preparation. It was a son being forced to feel not only the honor of inheritance, but the terrible weight of being discussed in terms no child ever truly wants to hear from a living parent. And it was a family discovering that the monarchy had already begun preserving certain truths in writing before everyone inside it was emotionally ready to admit them aloud. What made this feel so different was that the record was said to involve not merely general succession, but the shape of Prince William's royal future in practical, symbolic, and constitutional terms. Not the abstract future that every heir carries from birth, not the distant future people discuss politely as though it belongs to another era. Something more immediate than that, more defined, more structured. And because it came through a palace record rather than informal discussion, it suggested that the monarchy had been quietly planning around questions no one wanted the public to think were pressing. The first private reaction was not outrage, it was silence. William, according to those close enough to understand the mood without ever describing themselves publicly, is said to have received the development with a composure that only made the moment more painful. He did not react like a man surprised by the existence of planning. Every heir knows planning exists. What unsettled him was something else. It was the realization that the planning had reached a degree of formality, preservation, and emotional seriousness that could no longer be dismissed as theoretical. He had spent years carrying duty. He had accepted preparation. He had stepped more and more into the language of continuity. But this was different. This was not guidance. It was the archive touching the future directly. Catherine's response, by contrast, is believed to have been deeply perceptive from the first moment. She understood the danger immediately. Not just public danger, but emotional danger. Because once William's future begins to be framed through a reopened palace record, he ceases, even in private family terms, to be only a son standing beside his father. He becomes the subject of transition language. And transition language is merciless. It speaks in terms of readiness, structure, burden, and sequence. It rarely leaves space for the softer truths of love, fear, or the desire for time. Charles himself reportedly appeared grave even by his own measured standards. This was not a display of authority. It was an admission of gravity. A monarchy survives by planning for moments it prays will not come too soon. That is one of its oldest disciplines. But there is a terrible loneliness in being the king who must open a record that may affect how people think about his son's future, and therefore, inevitably, how they think about the limits of his own present reign. Yet to understand why this record carried such force, it is necessary to go back. The story did not begin in that room. It did not begin on the day the file was opened, and it certainly did not begin with one dramatic revelation. The decision to preserve such a record had been growing for far longer, built out of anxiety, precedent, health concerns, continuity planning, family sensitivity, and the increasingly difficult reality that the monarchy was entering a period in which emotional truth and constitutional necessity could no longer be kept comfortably apart. The truth was more painful. From the moment Charles became king, the palace inherited two realities at once. One was public. A new sovereign had ascended, the institution had stabilized, and the line of succession remained clear. The other was private. The monarchy had entered a compressed era. The old luxury of imagining transitions as distant and almost ceremonial had faded. The family was older. The public was more impatient. The media environment was more brutal. And William's place was no longer simply that of an heir in waiting far from the center. He was increasingly the operational future of the crown, whether the family wished to speak about that plainly or not. That mattered, because succession is not only a legal fact, it is an emotional architecture. Succession meant the lawful order by which the crown passes from one person to the next. But in lived royal life, succession begins long before a sovereign dies. It begins when the heir's image, workload, authority, and symbolic presence start to absorb expectations once reserved for the monarch. It begins when public trust subtly transfers. It begins when advisors start asking, not only what must be done today, but who must be able to carry it tomorrow. That transfer is often gentle from the outside. Inside the palace, it can feel like a quiet storm. For a time, the royal household managed this with caution. William was elevated carefully, not suddenly. He took on more prominence, more symbolic weight, more responsibility, but always within the language of supporting his father, never overshadowing him. That was intentional. The monarchy could survive many things, but not the appearance of a son waiting too visibly for a father's role. Continuity had to feel respectful, not impatient. Preparation had to look like service, not anticipation. But then came the incident that, by many accounts, changed everything. It did not happen on a balcony. It did not happen during a speech. It did not even happen in front of cameras. It took place during a closed palace briefing, tied to future state planning. One of those hidden meetings in which the machinery of monarchy examines timelines, responsibilities, contingencies, and the delicate question of readiness. Continuity planning was not abdication planning in the dramatic sense people often imagine. It was the disciplined practice of ensuring that the crown could function under all foreseeable circumstances, including illness, sudden pressure, or accelerating demands on the sovereign's energy. At that briefing, it is said, a disagreement emerged over how quickly William's public role might need to expand if pressures on the king intensified. One group reportedly argued for gradualism. Another said the pace of events was already forcing a functional transition in all but name. A regency is a formal arrangement under which another person carries sovereign duties when the monarch cannot. This was not necessarily about that. But the very fact that such conceptual territory was being approached, even indirectly, caused unease. Because once the palace begins openly discussing the line between assistance and substitution, the emotional atmosphere changes forever. William was not believed to be present for every technical discussion, but he was certainly at the center of their meaning. Catherine, too, became unavoidable in them, because the future of an heir is never only about one man. It is about the pair who will eventually embody the next chapter of the crown. Their children, their schedule, their symbolic authority, their public steadiness, their ability to absorb national expectation without collapsing under it. All of that begins to matter long before titles change. What disturbed some senior figures most was not the existence of planning, it was the tone. Planning had become less abstract, more urgent, less ceremonial, more operational. The official household was the working system of the monarchy. Private secretaries, constitutional advisors, ceremonial staff, communications officers, archivists, legal minds, and senior courtiers, whose duty was to turn family life into stable governance. Efficient people, loyal people. But in that moment, some of them began speaking as if William's future was no longer a distant horizon. It was an approaching structure. That was when Charles reportedly requested that an older palace record be brought back into review. This record, according to those who now refer to it with unusual seriousness, was said to include preserved guidance, observations, and internal considerations from an earlier period of royal transition management, possibly involving the late Queen's thinking on the delicate balance between preparing an heir and protecting the dignity of a reigning sovereign. This was not gossip, it was institutional memory. And institutional memory is one of the most powerful things in monarchy because it allows the dead to continue shaping the living without ever raising their voices. When Charles opened it, those present understood at once that he was not merely seeking information. He was seeking permission from history. That mattered, because Charles knew the danger before anyone needed to explain it. He knew what it meant to spend decades as heir. He knew what it meant to prepare endlessly, while the present still belonged to someone else. He knew the discipline required not to let preparation become resentment. He knew the ache of waiting, the humiliation of being necessary but not central, visible but not decisive. No one in that family understood better than he did the emotional cost of a long heirship. And because he understood it, he also feared imposing a new version of that burden on William in a more compressed and public age. But before the family could process what the reopened record might mean, another layer of tension surfaced. William and Charles reportedly met in private, in one of those closed-door conversations that shape royal life far more than any public ceremony ever could. No one raised their voice, but the stakes were immense. This was not father against son in a melodramatic sense. It was present reign against future reign. It was love facing duty, and discovering that duty had already been writing notes in the background. Charles is said to have spoken first, cautiously, emphasizing continuity, not alarm. He framed the record as part of responsible governance, not a message of immediate change. He reminded William that the monarchy has always prepared in silence for what it hopes will not come quickly. That is how it survives. Yet even as he spoke, the emotional contradiction remained impossible to ignore. A father was telling his son that planning for the crown's future did not diminish the present. But the very act of opening the record suggested that time itself had entered the room. William listened, but those close to the atmosphere suggest he felt something deeper than concern. He felt exposure. He had accepted service. He had accepted scrutiny. He had accepted that one day the full burden would be his. What he had not expected was the force of seeing his future treated not merely as destiny, but as an active file, a documented possibility, a burden already being measured. He had expected preparation. He had not expected the archive. And that distinction changed everything. Because an archive makes the future feel real, in a way conversation never can. A spoken thought can be reinterpreted. A family reassurance can soften. A difficult mood can pass. But a palace record means someone, sometime, believed this matter serious enough to preserve, serious enough to retrieve, serious enough to place before the king again at a moment of national consequence. This was the point, according to some accounts, when Catherine's role became crucial. Not publicly, quietly, she is believed to have helped William see what Charles himself may have struggled to say plainly, that the record was not an act of displacement, It was an act of protection. Protection for the institution, yes, but also protection for William. Because if his future was indeed accelerating, the worst thing the palace could do was allow it to arrive through confusion. The future had to be prepared in order not to look opportunistic. That was the hidden cruelty of royal life. Even readiness must be staged with emotional restraint. Yet the story did not end in reassurance. The record contains something far more difficult than general planning. It reportedly laid out principles about how and when an heir's public authority should expand without undermining the sovereign's dignity. It spoke about symbolic transfer. It spoke about representational balance. It addressed the danger of asking too much too late, and the equal danger of moving too far too soon. This was not a timetable. It was more subtle than that. More dangerous, too. It was a map of thresholds. A threshold in monarchy is the moment when support becomes substitution in the public mind. That mattered because the public does not need an official declaration to sense that power is shifting. It sees it in appearances, workload, deference, seating, visibility, and tone. It sees who is sent where. It sees who speaks after whom. It sees who begins to embody steadiness when the nation feels uncertain. And once the public starts reading one royal as tomorrow more than today, the institution enters a very delicate phase indeed. Charles reportedly understood that better than anyone, which is why the record unsettled him as much as it did William. He did not open it out of cold calculation. He opened it because events had brought him to the edge of a question every monarch dreads. How do you protect your reign while preparing the country for a future that is already approaching? And how do you do that when the future has your son's face? The silence deepened across the household. Senior advisors were drawn closer. Constitutional figures reviewed language. Private secretaries re-examined schedules, not because anyone intended a dramatic announcement, but because the meaning of appearances had changed. The Lord Chamberlain's office, which lives close to ceremonial order, is believed to have become especially attentive. Ceremonial precedence meant the visible ranking and sequence through which monarchy expresses structure. Who receives what deference? Who hosts what event? Who leads what procession? Who represents the crown in which setting? These are not decorative details. They are constitutional feelings dressed as ceremony. If William's role was about to subtly expand under principles contained in the reopened record, then every future event would need calibration. Too much prominence, and people would ask whether the crown was quietly shifting. Too little, and the palace would look as though it were ignoring practical reality. The monarchy could survive many things, but not confusion over who was carrying its emotional center in a moment of strain. This is where the record became more than history. It became instruction. According to accounts circulating through informed royal circles, one of the most significant lines or principles in the record was said to concern timing not as a calendar matter, but as a moral one. The future must never appear to advance at the expense of the present. That may sound simple. Inside monarchy, it is almost impossibly difficult, because the future always advances. Bodies age, burdens grow, public expectation shifts. Yet for the crown to remain emotionally legitimate, the heir must seem ready without seeming eager, visible without seeming invasive, dutiful without seeming to rehearse inheritance. William understood that. In fact, he may have understood it too well. That is why the reopened record was so heavy for him. It did not flatter. It warned. It reminded him that his future could not be entered casually, and that the nearer it came, the lonelier his role would become. He was not being invited into glory. He was being drawn deeper into sacrifice. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. Because while commentators would inevitably frame this as a dramatic boost to William's royal standing, the private reality was far harsher. A son was being asked to stand closer to history, while still pretending history was not moving. A father was being asked to preserve dignity, while authorizing preparation for a world that would one day continue without him. And a wife, Catherine, was being drawn still more tightly into the invisible mathematics of burden, symbolism, and national expectation. What happened next forced the matter even further. Word began to move beyond the palace, first in fragments, then in shape. Not the contents of the record in full, not a leaked transcript, something more powerful in royal terms. the knowledge that Charles had reopened a historic internal record about the heir's future, and that the reopening was linked to active planning. That was enough to electrify every newsroom in the country. Editors did not need the full document to sense the stakes. If the king had reached into the archive on a matter involving William's role, then the monarchy had crossed from quiet management into visible preparation. Broadcasters interrupted routine segments to pivot back to royal coverage. Palace correspondents began speaking in unusually careful language, the kind that signals genuine seriousness behind the scenes. Commentators revived old discussions about modern monarchy, compressed transitions, and the burden now resting on the Prince and Princess of Wales. Crowds gathered near palace gates not because anyone expected a dramatic declaration that afternoon, but because the public has an instinct for these moments. It knows when something larger than ceremony is happening. Inside the palace, the communications challenge became immediate. A state communication was a formal message shaped to stabilize public understanding without surrendering institutional control. But what could be said? Too little, and the palace would look secretive at exactly the moment the country sensed change. Too much, and it would invite dangerous readings about the king's condition, the pace of transition, and the internal emotional state of the family. The line had to be walked with the utmost care. Charles's advisors, by most accounts, urged caution. William's team, though no doubt respectful, likely understood that silence alone would now be interpreted as confirmation of something more severe. Catherine, ever aware of symbolic tone, is believed to have favored steadiness over drama. No one wanted spectacle. The record itself had already created enough of that in imagination. What was needed was control. Yet control was not easy, because the subject touched one of the monarchy's most sensitive wounds. This was not merely about future duties. It was about the emotional transfer of authority within a family that has spent generations trying to make such transfers look smooth, dignified, and almost painless. The truth is that they are never painless. They are simply well managed when monarchy is at its best. And perhaps that is why the reopened record struck such a deep chord across the nation. People understood instinctively that this was not about ambition. It was about inevitability. The future had been preserved in paper long before the public was ready to hear it named. A second private confrontation reportedly followed, this time sharper in feeling if not in tone. William is said to have asked the hardest question an heir can ask a reigning father, without ever saying it directly. Is this about planning, or is this about preparing the country to see me differently now? Charles, according to those who understand the weight of such exchanges, did not answer in a way that fully removed the pain, because no answer could. If he said it was only planning, the reopened record would still exist. If he said it was more than planning, the family would be admitting that transition had entered active moral space. No one raised their voice, but the silence itself became almost unbearable. Charles then reportedly explained what perhaps lay at the heart of his decision. The record had been opened not because he wished to accelerate the future, but because the institution could not afford to stumble into it unprepared. That mattered because there is a vast difference between handing over power and making sure the ground beneath the heir is stable when history begins pressing harder. The latter is not surrender. It is stewardship. A steward does not abandon the office. He protects its continuity beyond himself. That word, stewardship, changed the emotional meaning of the moment. William may still have felt shaken, but now the issue could be seen more clearly. This was not about replacing one reign with another in secret. It was about safeguarding the path between them. The path had to be coherent. It had to be dignified. It had to protect Charles from the cruelty of appearing sidelined and protect William from the equal cruelty of appearing unprepared. That is what the record was for. Not to announce a future date, but to keep the interval from becoming chaotic. Still, the record's existence inevitably affected how everyone around the heir would now be seen. Catherine, in particular, entered a more exposed, symbolic position. Every appearance would now carry added meaning. Every state event, every church service, every overseas visit, every carefully framed image of the Wales family would be read not only as present duty, but as future architecture. She had long lived with scrutiny. This was something more. It was scrutiny under transition. That is a lonely place to stand. Because the future queen must embody both support and serenity, while carrying pressures no ordinary public figure could describe without appearing to complain. She must look calm while becoming more central. She must appear grateful, not burdened, even when burden is exactly what history is placing upon her. If the reopened record changed William's future, it changed hers too, whether anyone chose to say so publicly or not. As national discussion intensified, some observers began speculating wildly about regency, abdication, or hidden timelines. But those closer to royal logic understood the record differently. It was less dramatic and, for that reason, more consequential. It was not about a sudden constitutional rupture. It was about managed escalation of the heir's role within boundaries designed to protect the sovereign's dignity. In a way, that is more important than any sensational theory. Monarchy is rarely transformed by theatrical announcements. It is transformed by quiet internal adjustments that gradually reshape public reality. The official household now had to operationalize those adjustments without appearing to do so. That is one of the palace's oldest arts. It might mean William leading more visible national moments. It might mean broader representational responsibilities. It might mean Catherine assuming stronger symbolic visibility beside him. It might mean deeper briefing access, expanded planning authority, and more direct involvement in matters once handled at a greater remove. None of those steps would be announced as historic, yet taken together, they would change the monarchy's center of gravity. And that was the real story. Not that Charles had surrendered anything, but that he had acknowledged something. He had acknowledged that the future could not remain only an abstraction, because abstraction creates fragility when reality begins to move faster than ritual. The monarchy chose preparation over denial. That is what the record, once opened, truly signaled. By late afternoon, a final internal discussion reportedly brought several strands together. Senior advisors summarized practical implications. William's office clarified what could and could not be expanded. Communication staff shaped language that emphasized support, continuity, and service. Charles, it is said, listened carefully, and then made one thing unmistakably clear. Whatever changes followed would not be framed as a retreat of the present, but as a strengthening of the line that protects it. That mattered, because it restored dignity to the act itself. The record was no longer a threat hanging over father and son. It became a shield, one designed to keep the future from arriving through confusion, gossip, or institutional scramble. If William's role was to deepen, it would deepen in a way that honored Charles rather than diminished him. If the country was to sense the coming shape of the monarchy more clearly, it would do so through steadiness, not spectacle. The public leak, however, could not be entirely undone. By evening, the phrase, "palace record," was everywhere. Analysts discussed succession pressure. Former courtiers offered cautious interpretations. Newspaper columns filled with speculation about what the record might contain and why Charles had reopened it now. Some called it a masterstroke of stability. Others called it a heartbreaking sign that the monarchy had entered its next emotional phase sooner than expected. Both readings contained truth, because this was not a victory for anyone. It was not triumph for William, who now had to carry even more visible destiny while still honoring the emotional truth that his father reigns in the present. It was not relief for Charles, who had just made the future harder to ignore by acting responsibly toward it. It was not ease for Catherine, who would now be read through the lens of coming authority more intensely than ever. And it was certainly not comfort for a family that has already lived too long under the pressure of history. Late that evening, there came what many would later describe as the day's most powerful image. Charles and William appeared together, not in a grand tableau, not in some overt declaration of unity, but simply side by side after an engagement, composed, serious, almost solemn. That image mattered because it answered the loudest public fear without speaking a word. There was no rupture, no visible coldness, no performance of succession, just continuity in human form. Father and son, present and future, not merged, not competing, but standing in the same frame with the knowledge of history between them. Catherine, too, appeared later, with the kind of calm that royal life demands at its hardest moments. No theatrical emotion, no visible strain for the cameras, yet those who understand the language of monarchy would have seen it. The deeper stillness, the added weight, the unmistakable sense that she and William were now being watched, not only as senior royals, but as a nearer future than the country had perhaps been ready to admit. And perhaps that is what the reopened record really changed most of all. Not the law, not the line of succession, not the title William will one day hold regardless. It changed the emotional timetable of the monarchy. It made preparation visible. It reminded the country that the future of the crown is never merely inherited. It is built, document by document, silence by silence, burden by burden, while those who carry it are still trying to live as a family. The story did not end with the file being opened. It was reframed by it. Because this was not simply the king consulting history. It was history informing the king that the old comfort of distance had ended. William's royal future had changed not because a title had moved or a law had shifted, but because the palace had acknowledged, in preserved writing and present action, that his role now belonged to active preparation, not passive expectation. This was not abdication theater. It was something more royal and more sorrowful than that. It was the monarchy doing what it has always done when reality presses hardest. Recording, preparing, adjusting, and hoping the public sees continuity where the family feels only weight. The country saw a dramatic palace development. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. A father opened a record because duty required it. A son looked at his future and saw not glory, but structure. A wife understood that service would now demand even more silence from the two of them. And the institution, as ever, kept moving, not because the feelings had been resolved, but because monarchy has no choice except to move through unresolved feeling and call it continuity. In the end, the palace record changed Prince William's royal future because it transformed that future from destiny into active design. It said, without ever needing to say it bluntly, that the next chapter is no longer far enough away to be spoken of casually. It must be protected. It must be shaped. It must be entered with discipline, sorrow, dignity, and control. The monarchy chose preparation over illusion. It chose stewardship over sentimental delay. It chose to admit that the future was approaching without dishonoring the present. That is not a cold decision. It is one of the hardest decisions royal life ever requires. Charles remained king. William remained heir. But after that record was opened, neither role could feel quite as distant from the other as they once did. The bridge between them had been named, preserved, and set back into motion. The family may remain united, but it is united under the weight of a truth that can no longer be hidden behind formal smiles and carefully paced schedules. Some inheritances begin at birth. Others begin the moment a father opens a file and a son realizes history has already begun writing him into the next room. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.